Oh my gosh, there is Mr. Irresponsible himself sitting on top of that horse. Um, he has just stolen this horse and he's feeling pretty good about himself. Um, let's move on to lesson 11. Toad had traveled some miles, his horse and he. Is it his horse? No. And he was feeling drowsy in the hot sunshine when the horse stopped and began to nibble the grass. And Toad, waking up, just saved himself from falling off. He looked about him and found he was on a wide common. Do you remember what a common was? We talked about it being sort of like a park, a common area where people can come. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. I need a drink. Near him stood a gypsy caravan, and beside it was a man sitting on an upturned bucket. A fire of sticks was burning nearby, and over the fire hung an iron pot, and from out of that pot came rich and varied smells. Toad was hungry. He looked the gypsy over carefully, wondering whether it would be easier to fight him or persuade him. So there he sat and sniffed and looked at the gypsy, and the gypsy sat and looked at him. Presently, the gypsy remarked, "Want to sell that there horse of yours?" Toad was completely taken aback. Nevertheless, the gypsy's suggestion seemed to smooth the way toward the two things he wanted: money and breakfast. "What?" he said. "Me sell this beautiful young horse? Oh, no. Besides, I'm too fond of him. All the same, how much might you be willing to offer me?" The gypsy looked the horse over. "Shillin' a leg," he said briefly, and turned away. A shilling is a British coin. So how many shillings is the gypsy offering? That's right. "A shilling a leg," cried Toad. "If you please, I must take a little time to work that out." And he climbed down off his horse and did the sums on his fingers, and at last he said, "A shilling a leg? Why, that comes to exactly 4 shillings. That's simply not enough." "Well," said the gypsy, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make it 5 shillings, and that's more than the animal's worth." Then Toad sat and pondered. He was keenly aware that he was hungry and penniless. At last he said firmly, "Look here, you give me 6 shillings and 6 pence and as much breakfast as I can eat, and in return I will hand over my horse." The gypsy grumbled, but in the end he counted out 6 shillings and 6 pence into Toad's open paw, and then he disappeared into the caravan and returned with a large iron plate. He tilted up the pot, and a stream of hot, rich stew gurgled onto the plate. Toad took the plate in his lap. He thought that he had never eaten so good a breakfast in all his life. When Toad had eaten as much stew as he possibly could, he got up and said goodbye to the gypsy and the horse. After receiving directions from the gypsy, he set forth on his travels again. As he tramped along, he thought of his adventures and how, when things seemed at their worst, he always found a way out. Toad's pride and conceit began to swell up within him. "Ho, ho," he said to himself, "what a clever Toad I am." He got so puffed up with conceit that he made up a song as he walked in praise of himself, and sang it at the top of his voice, though there was no one to hear it but him. "The world has held great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad. The clever men at Oxford know all that there is to be knowed, but then none of them know half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad." The animals sat in the ark and cried, their tears in torrents flowed. Who was it said, "There's land ahead," encouraging Mr. Toad? The army all saluted as they marched along the road. Was it the king or president? No, it was Mr. Toad. He sang as he walked, and got more inflated every minute. But his pride was shortly to have a severe fall. After a while, Toad reached the main road, and there he saw approaching him a speck that turned into a dot and then into something very familiar. "This is the life again," said the excited Toad. "I will hail my brothers of the wheel, and they will give me a lift." He stepped confidently out into the road when suddenly he became very pale. His knees shook, and he collapsed. And well he might, for the approaching car was the very one he had previously stolen. He sank down in a miserable heap in the road, murmuring to himself, "It's all over." The motor car drew slowly nearer, till at last he heard it stop just short of him. The two gentlemen got out and walked around the heap lying in the road, and one of them said, "Oh dear, here's a poor old thing, a washerwoman apparently, who has fainted in the road. Let us take her to the nearest village." They tenderly lifted Toad into the motor car and proceeded on their way. When Toad heard them talk so kindly, he cautiously opened first one and then the other eye. "Look," said one of the gentlemen, "she's getting better already. How do you feel now, ma'am?" "Thank you kindly, sir," said the Toad in a feeble voice. "I'm feeling a great deal better." "Now don't try to talk," said the gentleman. "I won't," said Toad. "I was only thinking if I might sit in the front seat there beside the driver, where I could get the fresh air full in my face, I should soon be all right again." "What a sensible woman," said the gentleman. "Of course you shall." So they helped Toad into the front seat beside the driver. Toad was now almost himself again. He sat up and tried to beat down the old cravings that rose up and took possession of him. "It is fate," he said to himself. "Why struggle?" And he turned to the driver at his side. "Please, sir," he said, "would you kindly let me try and drive the car? I should like to be able to tell my friends that I have had the privilege." The driver laughed at the proposal so heartily that the gentleman inquired what the matter was, and when he heard, he said to Toad's delight, "I like your spirit. Let her have a try." Toad scrambled into the seat vacated by the driver, took the steering wheel in his hands, listened with affected humility at the instructions, and set the car in motion. The gentlemen behind applauded, and Toad heard them saying, "Fancy, a washerwoman driving a car as well as that the first time." Toad went a little faster. He heard the gentleman call out warningly, "Be careful, washerwoman," and this annoyed him, and he became angry. The driver tried to interfere, but the Toad made the car speed even faster. "Washerwoman indeed," he shouted recklessly. "I am the Toad who always escapes. Sit still and you shall know what driving really is." And with a cry of horror, the whole party rose and flung themselves on him. "Seize him!" they cried. Alas, they should have remembered to stop the motor car before attempting to seize Toad, and with a turn of the wheel, the Toad sent the motor car crashing through a hedge. One mighty bound, and the wheels of the car were churning up the thick mud of a horse pond. Oh dear. Toad found himself flying through the air. He eventually landed on his back in the soft grass of a meadow. Sitting up, he could just see the motor car in the pond. The gentleman and the driver were floundering in the water. He picked himself up and set off, running across country as hard as he could. He ran till he was breathless and weary and had to go at a slower pace. When he had recovered his breath, he began to laugh. "Ha, ho!" he cried in ecstasies of self-admiration. "Toad, as usual, comes out on top." Then he burst into song again. A slight noise at the distance behind him made him turn his head and look. Oh, horror! About 2 fields off, the chauffeur or driver and 2 large policemen were visible, running toward him. Toad sprang to his feet and pelted away. "Oh my," he gasped as he ran. "What a fool I am! What a conceited numpty!" Toad glanced back and saw that they were gaining on him. On he ran desperately. He did his best, but his legs were short. Ceasing to heed where he was going, he struggled on wildly, when suddenly the earth failed under his feet. Toad grasped at the air, and splash! He found himself head over ears in deep water. He had run straight into the river. Toad rose to the surface and tried to grasp the reeds, but the stream was so strong that it tore them out of his hands. "Oh my," he gasped, poor Toad. "If ever I steal a motor car again," and down he went again, and came up spluttering. Presently he saw that he was approaching a big dark hole in the bank, just above his head. As the stream bore past him, he reached up with a hand and caught hold of the edge, and then slowly he drew himself out of the water, and he was able to rest his elbows on the edge of the hole. And as he stared before him into the dark hole, some bright small thing twinkled in its depth. As it approached, a face grew up gradually around it, and it was a familiar face, brown and small, with whiskers. It was the water rat. At the beginning of today's Read Aloud, we find Mr. Toad riding along on a stolen horse. He's tired and keenly hungry, and what does he do? He sells the horse to a gypsy for money and breakfast. As Toad is walking along, a motor car comes by. Who is in the motor car? The same people that he's stolen it from before. Why don't they recognize him, though? Because he's still dressed as a washerwoman. So how does Toad manage to get behind the wheel of that motor car once more? He's tricky, isn't he? He says that since they don't recognize him, that he would like to sit in the front because the air up there would help him recover from fainting. And when they do that, he asks if he can drive the car, and the gentleman thinks it's a funny proposal, and he likes Toad's spirit, so they let Toad take the wheel of the car. Once he's in the driver's seat, how does Toad drive? Does he drive in a normal, safe manner? No, he is a reckless driver. Why does Toad run straight into the river after getting out of the horse pond? Well, the chauffeur or driver and the policeman are chasing him and gaining on him, and he's looking back and not paying attention to where the ground drops off, and he falls right into the river. Toad is very conceited and irresponsible. Do you think that he will ever learn from his mistakes? Why or why not? He is a nice Toad, but so far he is still being irresponsible. We may have to finish the stories to find out.